I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There was a theologian named Austin Farrer who served for 25 years as the chaplain of Trinity College in Oxford. In that role, Farrer preached quite regularly, so regularly, in fact, that his published homilies from that time all begin with some version of, "As I was saying." Now, to be clear, I don't need those kind of problems. But Farrer, that sort of unbroken flow of teaching, of thought, was on my mind this week, because we have another long, long passage from John's Gospel, the second of 3 such passages we read in Lent, and the second of these 3 stories from John's Gospel that have been a part of our Lenten tradition for the last 1,800 years. And last Sunday, Dean Malloy preached about the Samaritan woman at the well, about her thirst and ours, our thirst to be known and accepted, our thirst for truth and authenticity, our thirst for more. And the dean spoke about how many people, too many people, would never think that they could have their thirst quenched at church. And in this week's gospel, the healing of this man born blind, it feels like the next challenge. So we know we're thirsty. We know we've come here with deep needs, wondering if they could possibly be met. And this week's gospel answers that question. What does God have to say about that? What does God have to say to and about suffering people, our suffering world? And if we're remembering all those people who aren't here with us this morning, and I mean living people, the people who are off having brunch or something right now, if we're thinking about them and the state of our church, those questions become even more important, because this is the gospel that we have to preach. This is the gospel that we have to live out. What does God have to say to and about people who have deep and profound needs? Why does this kind of suffering even happen? Because that question is how we meet the man at the center of this healing miracle. Our text does not give this man born with blindness a name, but Jesus and his disciples encounter him seemingly begging at the roadside. And the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. That was a radical answer in the ancient world. The common belief was that your outward fortunes reveal your inward character. If you had bad luck or good luck, if you got sick, if you were able-bodied or were a person with a disability, all of that was a reflection on you, on how you lived your life, whether or not you were a good person. The disciples were asking Jesus if he could weigh in on a theological issue raised in the Talmud about when sin enters into this situation, not if. I should acknowledge that being blind in the first century was a very, very different prospect than it is today. This was not an accessible society, and there was little impetus to be one. Disabilities disordered relationships and broke social connections. Just like sin disorders relationships and breaks our connections, so ipso facto, sin caused suffering. Our society now regularly fails to be inclusive and acceptable, but we're talking about a much different scale in a very different time. So for the disciples, meeting someone who was born without sight is like a real object lesson. Whose fault is this? Where and how does sin enter the picture here? Who did something wrong? Was it this man or his parents? And Jesus' answer is, neither. No one has sinned here. This is no one's fault. Jesus breaks the connection between sin and suffering. That's the core of this encounter. Jesus says, "No one here has sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." If you were comforted by that broken link between sin and suffering, this rejoinder might throw you off guard. So if a misfortune is not my fault, does that mean that it's God's fault? Also, no. God does not want us to hurt. God does not disable us. God does not make us sick or harm us just to teach us a lesson. But pain and sickness and sorrow are a part of our lives in this broken and imperfect world. And God's answer to that is himself, to come and be with us in the person of Jesus Christ. It's that John 3:16 that Deacon Curtis preached on the week before last, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God is with us and for us through it all, to the end and after the end. That is the point of our Lenten journey and the message of the cross, that fear is not the last word, pain is not the last word, even death itself is not the end of God's love for us. So when we see pain and suffering in the world, when we see broken relationships because of our lack of acceptance, the question to ask is just like Deacon Curtis said, where is the love? And the answer in this gospel story and in our own lives is Jesus. Jesus is the love. I do want to take a moment to lift up how marvelous and strange this story is. There's spit and mud and smearing. It's very tactile. This is no healing that happens through directions. This is not take up your mat and walk. Go, your faith has made you well. Just like God said, "Let there be light," and made human beings out of the dust of the earth, Jesus, the light of the world, takes dirt and makes humanity new. But John sort of takes this incredible thing in stride, and the man does too, for that matter. Our narrative doesn't spend too much time on the spit and the mud. The majority of our gospel deals with the aftermath, the fallout from this miracle. This man's neighbors, Jesus' critics, the Pharisees, and other religious authorities are working as hard as they can not to trust their own eyes. They can't believe this is the same man who had been among them, blind, begging. They have to question him repeatedly. They have to question his parents. And in the end, they can't accept it. They can't tolerate the miracle. They cannot let this man in from the margins of their collective life. Jesus has broken the connection between sin and suffering. He's repudiated it. And to them, that's scary. It opens this chasm in our human experience. It takes the guardrails off. Because if sin causes that kind of suffering, disabilities, illness, accidents, then these people can understand the world. They can understand the rules. If sin causes suffering, they're safe. And I don't think we've left this mindset in the first century where it belongs. All too often we act as though our luck is a referendum on who we are, on our humanity. That bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. Because without that, we're left with much harder truths. Because the truth is, we need each other. Our lives are fundamentally linked. Martin Luther King Jr. called it an inescapable network of mutuality. Christ says again and again that to love God and to love our neighbors is the single greatest commandment. We cannot do one without the other. And yet we have built a society designed to tear apart what God has joined together. In bringing sight to a man born blind, God is not making him over from bad to good. Jesus is not making this man somehow more worthy. But an encounter with God leaves this man changed, transformed, and it's a change that he welcomes. In his life, to be unable to see was to be damaged and stigmatized and cast out. But not to Jesus. Not in his life with God, his fundamental humanity. This man always mattered to Jesus. But it is precisely those systems of exclusion and disregard that Jesus needs the Pharisees to become blind to. Jesus says, "I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." For example, this man's neighbors and his spiritual leaders, they can see clearly that it would take work to restore this man to the community. He had been begging to support himself. Who knows what he would need, what he was going to need to help fully join the life of the community. They could see that. They could see the work it was going to take. And our world now is similar. We can see the status quo. We can see how easy it is to just live with it, with things as they are. If you missed it, please read Matthew Desmond's essay on poverty from this week's New York Times. I think it was on Thursday. Writing about American poverty, Desmond says, we're addicted to it. It makes our lives easier. We see how difficult it will be to change. So we need to become blind to the ways of this world. We need to unsee false idols of power and privilege, unsee the easy way out of the hard changes. We need to become blind to our own bad habits of life that keep us from coming together in deeper regard, in deeper community with each other. Seeing has made us blind, and we need God's light to shine a way forward. In our gospel, we hear not only that Jesus gives sight to those who long to see, we hear that Christ longs to take the wrong kind of sight away from us. Because without it, we could have so much more. Our thirst can be quenched with living water, and in our blindness, God's light still shines, and in his light, we see light. Light that is life for all people, light that shines through our darkness, and darkness cannot and will not overcome it.